Hi, this is Paul Salem, president of the Middle East Institute. I've been very happy hosting this podcast for the last year and had some great conversations, but I'm also very happy to welcome Alistair Taylor, who is MEI's new editorial director, and I want to thank him a lot for hosting the podcast for the last couple of weeks when I've been traveling, and I'm very pleased to announce that he will be generally hosting MEI's excellent podcast in the future. I hope to be a frequent guest on the show, and I hope you as listeners will welcome Alistair and continue to tune in. He's doing an excellent job. And I want to thank him for that and look forward to listening and joining in future podcasts.
From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. Today we're going to be talking about Turkey, a country that is currently facing a number of major challenges on the social, political, and foreign policy fronts. For those of you that are interested in Turkey, I should note that MEI will be hosting our 9th annual conference on Turkey next week, on December 4th. If you're interested in learning more about that, please consult our website. We've got 3 really interesting panels covering Turkey's economic and domestic policies, the youth dynamic, and relations with the West and the Middle East, as well as some great guests. And speaking of great guests, I'm joined by 2 today, Gonul and Max Hoffman. Gonul is the director of MEI's Center for Turkish Studies and an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Institute for Middle East Studies. Max is the associate director of national security and international policy at the Center for American Progress, where he focuses on Turkey and the Kurdish regions, among other topics. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Max, let's start with you. One of the panels at next week's conference is on the issues facing Turkey's youth. Turkey has quite a young population, around a quarter of which is under the age of 14. Given that the ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP, has now been in power for 16 years, there's a whole generation of young people that have never known another government. And what impact has that had on identity and issues like nationalism and religiosity?
Well, it's a remarkable story, right? I mean, someone born in 2000 or even 1995 would really have no concept of Turkey without Erdogan. And, we've set out to study this right-wing Turkish nationalism and particularly sort of whether Turkish nationalism was shifting into Erdoganism, particularly among young people in Turkey for the reason you outlined over the last year and a half. And it's a mixed bag. Young Turks have experienced remarkable economic growth and socioeconomic transformation. It's a much wealthier and more urbanized society than it was previously. So in many ways, they're more connected to the outside world. Of course, technology plays a big role there as well. Many young Turks are on social media, just like their, counterparts anywhere else in Europe or the United States. But they've also experienced profound insecurity. And that, the ongoing PKK conflict, of course, is part of that. The ISIL terror attacks over the last 5 years, really. And of course, the Syrian war, which has really defined a generation of Turks and the way they think about the region and security. So they actually share with their older Turkish counterparts a profound sense of insecurity. And the whole country really is in this kind of defensive crouch and has been for some time. And Erdogan has played upon that insecurity pretty effectively to cultivate this broad right-wing coalition to ensure his political hegemony. The other factor, the kind of defining question throughout modern Turkish history of the role of Islam and secularism, that's a little bit surprising what our studies, which were based on focus groups and polling, found on that question, which is, I think many people anticipate, think that younger Turks might be more religious because there's been a rise of Imam Hatip schools, these religious schools. Erdogan's rhetoric is very religiously tinged, more so than any modern Turkish leader. And that really wasn't the case. Actually, young Turks were less likely to say that they were practicing or particularly devout than their older counterparts. And that really surprised us in our research. So Erdogan's idea that he was going to raise a pious generation, which was his stated goal, that doesn't seem to be really playing out on the ground in Turkey, despite many outward signs of religiosity, like the headscarf and things like that. So, it's kind of a mixed bag. And I think the two factors I stopped, the two factors that will really define this generation of Turks moving forward is whether Turkey's economy can kind of click into the next gear after what seems to be an imminent economic crisis, can click into the next gear and find higher technology, higher added value industries for these young people to work in, and allow innovation and create that kind of environment for them. And then the other issue is the Syrian refugee crisis, and the 4 million Syrian refugees who are in Turkey. There are 300 Syrians born every day in Turkey. It's a very young population, and it promises a whole new stage of very tense social transformation.
The point that you make about religiosity is really interesting, precisely because of that disconnect between the discourse that Erdogan's been promoting and the results that you're seeing. Do you have any sense of kind of why, would you care to speculate as to why that's been the case? Why has that not been more kind of successful to push to increase religious education?
It's hard to say. The Imam Hatip schools, they're better funded. They've been expanded rapidly. They're just the actual output is not what young Turks really demand. I mean, there can only be so many actual imams in the country. What young Turks want is to learn English, to learn valuable skills that will get them a good paying job. And the Imam Hatip schools have not actually been terribly successful in that front. In fact, the university entrance exam scores from Imam Hatips are lower than from traditional public schools. So I think maybe that's part of it. As I said, also the context in which young Turks are maturing is very different. It's highly urbanized. They're on social media. They see young European counterparts and, for example, Germans of Turkish descent or Turks in Germany living very cosmopolitan lives. And, I think that undermines maybe some of the efforts to cultivate this real traditionalism. The one thing that Erdogan has been successful with, and that young Turks certainly, at least in our polling and focus groups, espouse is, very strong Turkish nationalism. And with the increased focus on the Ottoman legacy that was kind of totally forsaken by the modern Turkish Republic, and Ataturk actually trying to make a clean break with that past. And Erdogan and popular TV shows in Turkey, things like that, have really rejuvenated the Ottoman legacy. So that's interesting. I mean, it's not the religiosity that Erdogan would like, probably, at least not across the spectrum. It's not the total secularism that Ataturk tried to impose. It is in the middle, but young Turks are sort of at least contemplating the full range of their history now, and looking at that and concluding that Turkey should be a strong, independent country, that it should be less beholden to Western, security partners, and it should sort of forge its own path. So it's a mixed bag there.
Turkey has long been kind of had this nationalist strain. You go back to sayings like "a Turk has no friend but a Turk" and all these kind of things. So that's been there for a long time. But it is interesting to point out the kind of increasing reference to the Ottoman past that you noted there. I think that's the kind of one of the big differences from the situation now versus previously. Also, kind of on the issue of nationalism, Gonul, I wanted to switch over to you. That recent rise in nationalism that Max and I were just talking about, how do you see that factor into the broader domestic policy agenda?
In terms of what Erdogan would like to achieve, I think, let me step back. Erdogan's alliance with the Turkish nationalists, I think, worked very well for him since 2015. Because of that alliance, Erdogan kept winning elections after elections. So that alliance is key to his political calculus. But I think there is another factor. This alliance is, and this has been mentioned before, Erdogan makes alliances. In the past, worked very closely with the liberals, with the Gülenists, but the one he has with nationalists is an organic one. And I think if you look at the history of the Republic, you'll see that even the Islamists of the country, and this party, the AKP, is an Islamist-rooted party, even the Islamists of the country have been strongly nationalist, which is something that you do not see in the Middle East. In the Middle East, Islamism and nationalism, they don't really come together because ideologically there is a clash between them. But in Turkey, that has not been the case. And similarly, if you look at Turkey's communists, for instance, the Communist Party and the ideologues there, you see a strong sense of nationalism as well. So nationalism has been there and has been the backbone of not only the new republic, but also under the Ottoman Empire. It was a multi-ethnic empire, and yet Turkish nationalism was very strong. So I think that's why Erdogan, for him, it's just a natural way it just felt natural for him to strike this alliance with the nationalists. And I think this one, contrary to the other ones that he had, this one might last longer. For ideological reasons, but also for electoral reasons. And some argue that elections do not matter in Turkey, but I think in some ways they do. And I think Erdogan, despite the fact that he has consolidated power, he is still vulnerable in many ways. And I think within the current domestic context where anti-Kurdish sentiment is very strong, anti-Western sentiment is very strong, Erdogan doesn't really have anywhere else to turn but to nationalists. So that's why I think this alliance between Erdogan and the nationalists is here to stay, and it's key to what Erdogan wants to do, both domestically and in the region.
On that latter point, in terms of the region, how do you see it shaping the kind of Turkish foreign policy agenda?
Well, I think it's been that nationalism has been one of the most important, I think, drivers of Turkey's regional policy. This is nothing new. Nationalism always, I think, the use of nationalism in foreign policy to galvanize nationalism at home is not new. Previous governments have used it. But I think the current regional context provides a lot more room for Erdogan to use nationalism. Both to consolidate power at home, but also to use it in foreign policy. We have seen it in Syria. We have seen it in Iraq. In Iraq, for instance, Turkey was one of the leading opponents to the Iraqi Kurdish independence referendum. And before that, Turkey had cultivated very close partnership with the Iraqi Kurds. But because of domestic and electoral considerations, Turkey almost broke ties with the Iraqi Kurds. In Syria, again, that anti-Kurdish sentiment became the backbone of Turkey's Syria policy. Turkey launched 2 military incursions in an effort to curb Kurdish influence there. So nationalism has been playing a big role in Turkey's regional policy. And we can talk about the implications of that too, because the increasing Turkish nationalism, which we're seeing more of that now. Before the Arab uprisings, I think Turkey had a more neo-Ottoman narrative and with less emphasis on Turkish ethnic identity. And now what we're seeing is looks and sounds more like the Kemalist ethnic nationalism. And that is alienating the peoples of the region and the regimes in the region. But we also, in places like Crimea, for instance, Turkey, despite its close partnership with Russia in Syria and on the energy front, Turkey has been critical of the Russian aggression in Crimea, mainly because of its sensitivities vis-a-vis the Tatars, ethnic Turkic community living in Crimea. But I think the tone was less aggressive there. Not to alienate Russians. On the other hand, Turkey has been completely mute on the Chinese crackdown on Uyghurs, which is another Turkic community.
I was just about to ask you about that, because that's the obvious counterpoint there, where it's something that the government is clearly interested in bringing up, but not at the expense of ties with a more powerful country. And certainly in the case of China, it seems like that's something that they used to be quite vocal about, and then in recent years has kind of just dropped off the radar completely.
That's right. Turkey has been historically very sensitive, and yet Erdogan has been mute, and that's probably because Turkey has been trying to cultivate closer trade and even military ties to China. The current Turkish ambassador comes from a business background, and that's just an indication of how much value Turkey attaches to trade partnership, developing closer trade partnership with China. So I would argue that Turkey is selectively using nationalism in its foreign policy.
Also on the issue of foreign policy, I wanted to kind of delve into some of the current challenges facing Turkey in its foreign policy agenda, particularly take a look at the U.S. There have been a number of major issues of late that have negatively affected the U.S.-Turkish relationship. People have been throwing around words like divergence, rupture. Stephen Cook released that report earlier this month in which he said the strategic relationship between the U.S. and Turkey is over because of a lack of shared common interests and shared threat assessments. What's your take on the situation?
Well, this is certainly a really difficult time in Turkey-US relations, but the relationship suffered major blows in the past. What is different now is, I think, in the past, and we can talk about different instances in 1960s, 70s, there was a time when there was an arms embargo on Turkey after Turkey's military intervention into Cyprus. And later in the early 2000s, when Turkish parliament refused to allow the US to use the Turkish bases to attack Iraq. The difference then was, I think, there was always a constituency in the US and in Turkey that promoted closer ties with each other. During previous crises, it was always a center-right party and Turkish military that worked against breaking ties. And at the end of the day, those were the two actors that saved the relationship. What we're seeing today, and even early 2002, believe it or not, there was a time when the AKP was the most pro-US actor in Turkish politics. So in early 2000, when the relationship again was suffering, President Erdogan, his party, and also Turkish military stepped in to make the case that this relationship was too important to fail. And there is none of that now. Turkish military has turned very anti-American, so has the ruling party. And there is no other actor and constituency who can now promote closer ties. And a funny anecdote, but I think it's telling. I've been holding these Turkey conferences for 9 years, and I've been struggling with finding people from Turkey who are willing to come and speak here on the record. Both out of fear, but also members of parliament from different parties, from the CHP, MHP, even the Felicity Party. They think that this is not the right time to be talking, to be critical of Turkey in Washington. So I think that just sums up the sentiment there. So I think there is now a structural problem, aside from, we have contextual problems, and that can or cannot be fixed, but the structural problem, I think, is much more important.
I agree entirely. And part of the reason is that the Turkish state, Turkish society and the country itself has transformed. We mentioned urbanization, the economic growth, all of those things. It is a different Turkey. It's also freed from the Cold War constraints. Those things are sort of well known. But also we've seen in the last 3 years a dramatic transformation of the Turkish state. It predates the coup attempt, but completely accelerated after the coup attempt. You have sweeping purges. You have the constitutional referendum that formalized this, basically this kind of imperial court structure where a presidential palace is set atop this very weakened, politically cowed state bureaucracy. The military, as Gonul mentioned, is transformed, somewhat weakened, but more just politically reined in. That's probably a good thing, but it does mean that these old state institutions that kept the relations with the U.S. sort of on an even keel through times of political upheaval are not really able to do that anymore. If you think about a Turkish, a foreign minister bureaucrat or a mid-level officer who thinks that it's in Turkey's interest to have closer relations with the U.S., that's a very difficult position to argue in Turkey today, with nationalist fervor where it is and with the sort of mistrust within the bureaucracy in the wake of the coup attempt. So I agree entirely. Going back to something you had said earlier about, I agree with you, Gonul, that Erdogan views foreign policy largely in instrumental terms. And we were talking about this yesterday. Again and again, he will instrumentalize foreign policy to secure an election or to secure a certain electoral alliance. I think his response to the June 2015 elections is a big example of that, where he sort of pivoted. He saw that the Kurds had really abandoned him politically, and he pivoted hard to the nationalist right. Both sides reopened the conflict, but then he, began really aggressively countering Syrian Kurdish efforts at autonomy, things like that. And the part where I disagree a bit with Gonul is that I don't actually think the AKP is an Islamist party anymore. I think there is an Islamist base, 35-40% or so. But the rest of the party, and of course the other constituencies he needs to get him over 50% are just, maybe socially conservative, but real hardcore Turkish nationalists. And so Erdogan, in his rhetoric, in his foreign policy decisions, really emphasizes the points of overlap between those Islamist and just right-wing Turkish nationalist constituencies. And those points of overlap are primarily, rhetorical and real hostility towards the West and towards the United States. It's, a pretty aggressive regional line. And he kind of frames it in different ways. To the compassionate Islamist base, he frames it as, right, we're going to go into Syria, we're going in to protect the Ummah, we're going to save our brothers in Syria. To Turkish nationalists, he's saying, no, this is about ending Kurdish efforts at autonomy. And to everybody, he's saying, and we're going to send the refugees back because that's a hugely, touchy issue in Turkey. So, I don't know. I agree that it's instrumental.
But
for sure.
Let me set the record straight. I really do not think that Erdogan is an Islamist, and I've said that before. So I don't want people to misunderstand that. I think he has long abandoned. I don't think he's ideological at all. Yes, nationalism is important, but it's right there. It's also an instrument to be used and exploited for him. But now you can't really talk of about a party. There is no party anymore. There is no ideology. So he certainly is not an Islamist. And if you look at his track record, since he came to power in 2002, he could have Islamicized the state, and he hasn't done so. I think he framed his aim as raising pious generations, which could be a conservative agenda, but it's not an Islamist agenda. So I really, he's not an Islamist at all. He is just, his problem is him being an authoritarian leader, not an Islamist leader. And again, I think the steps that he has taken in the last 16 years, I think looks very much like his predecessors, where they wanted to consolidate power. So if he has any ideology, I think that is this statist ideology that really, in a way, worships the state and puts state above anything else. So that's what he is. He's certainly not an Islamist.
This is very much in line with kind of Turkish tradition and previous history,
yes.
for sure.
Oh no, now we agree entirely.
Now it's becoming a boring discussion.
No, just quickly. I know you should move on, but it's interesting because you're right. The Turkish secularists would say, no, of course he's an Islamist. He's done X, Y, Z. He's removed the headscarf ban. But if you think about the things he's done to desecularize in certain areas, it's been to remove impediments for religious people to get into the state and get into positions of state power, because he knows those are his people, even if he is not ideologically an Islamist. Whatever your views on that are, he's removed those impediments for the purposes, I would argue, of again, sort of instrumental to consolidate power and really also to guard against the risk that the old Turkish state kind of comes for him again. So
exactly, and I think he's a very smart politician, so he understands that Islamism, hardcore Islamism, does not really have a base in Turkey. There was a real Islamist party when Erdogan was running for office in 2002, and it received 1%. So he understands that.
Just shifting gears, before we wrap things up, I definitely wanted to touch on next year's local elections at the end of March. There have been a few recent developments on that front that I think are noteworthy and kind of merit discussion. The Nationalist Action Party, MHP, announced that it won't be fielding candidates in Turkey's three largest cities, Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, and will instead be backing the AKP candidates there. What's going on with this, and what are they likely to kind of get out of this deal? Gonul.
Well, in terms of, I often, people ask me, why do we even care about local elections in 2019? Well, I think, yes, March elections will not really change the political balance of power in Turkey in general. But I think these elections still matter because, first, big cities matter. And in the referendum of last year, Erdogan lost those big cities, Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir. And that's a huge deal for him because big cities are the backbone of Turkey's economic boom. And Erdogan, over the years, has built this clientelistic network. So he still needs to be able to feed those networks, and those cities are the key in that sense. So I think that's why we have to really watch closely what will happen in March. And I think second, and that's why this MHP-AKP alliance in those big cities is important, because I do not think that Erdogan could have won without the support and help from the MHP. We have seen that in 2017 referendum when big cities rejected the referendum. So I think that alliance is very important for him, and also for Erdogan. I think this that was a psychological blow to him, because he was the mayor of Istanbul for many years, and also remember 75% of Turkish population is now urban. So losing those cities, I think, would point to a worrying trend for Erdogan. And would tell him that he was losing ground. So I think this alliance with the MHP is very important to him. And there was a time when we all thought that there were cracks in the partnership over MHP proposal for amnesty for certain jailed criminals and other issues. The MHP leader said that they were not seeking an alliance with the AKP in the upcoming elections, but now it seems that that's not the case anymore, and that they will be cooperating, which is very important for Erdogan.
Great. Max, what about you? Are there any kind of issues that you'll be paying particularly close attention to over the next few months in the run-up to the elections?
Well, I mean, I think their importance is, I think Gonul really nailed their importance, so I won't dwell too much on that. I will be watching for, I mean, I really do think that as Istanbul goes, so goes Turkey. I think probably the AKP will be safe in Istanbul. It seems as if, I mean, Izmir has gone to them. It's a CHP stronghold, of course, but Ankara also seems at risk, even with the MHP sort of throwing in their lot with the AKP. They'll probably hang on in Istanbul, especially because the opposition is in such disarray and is infighting amongst themselves. I'll be watching that because it's very important for patronage networks that are crucial here. But then I'm also going to be watching for whether there's more of an electoral impact from the economic crisis. You know, Erdogan and the AKP were very successful in kind of stringing things along before the general election. And they've been moving private debt onto the public fisc in a variety of ways for several years now. But you know, the economy is really slowing down and people are really feeling it. You know, you talk to people in Istanbul, and they say the rent keeps rising, the prices at the grocery keep going up. My wife and I both work. I don't know how much longer we can do it. That sort of sense of kind of desperation and stringing it along has been going on for some time.
Onion prices are through the roof.
Exactly. Yeah.
Onion is important.
It is.
Turkish cuisine.
Mine too. But you know, I don't know how that will translate into votes, because also Erdogan has always been successful in changing the subject onto, you know, sort of returning to the core cultural affinity that really mobilizes his base. And I'm sure he'll find ways of doing that again. And of course, all of the structural impediments to opposition candidates, right? It's not fair. It's not a fair election. The media is 95% in the bag for the government. So I'll be watching those things. And then the last thing is, in the referendum, we saw hints of this shift. You know, the cities went against Erdogan. We saw hints of this shift to a basically rural-urban divide in Turkey, one that we see in other countries, including, you know, here at home in the United States. So I'm going to be watching that just because I'm curious if that is a wider, I mean, I think it is a wider phenomenon of kind of modern politics and modern society, these rural-urban shifts, but whether Turkey will continue down that path or not.
It'll be interesting and definitely something to keep an eye out for. You're not the only person to have noted the seeming similarities between the Turkish electoral map and the U.S. one with coastal, rural, urban divides and all that sort of thing. Great. Thank you very much, Gonul, Max, both for joining us today. And thank you to our audience for listening. And again, don't forget to check out our website for more information on the MEI Turkey Conference next week, where we'll be delving into many of these issues, as well as a number of others, in more detail. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.